Started with your talk. So again, thank you everyone for joining this Helping Boys Thrive virtual summit. Again, this is sponsored by the Boys Initiative. You can find out more about the Boys Initiative at theboysinitiative.org. Right now, we're going to hear from Dr. Mark Perry. And the title of his talk is Challenging Systemic Sexism in K-12 Schools and on College Campuses. Very, very interesting topic. And just quick background on Mark from your program here. Mark J. Perry is concurrently a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a professor of economics and finance at the University of Michigan's Flint campus. He's best known as the creator and editor of the popular economics blog Carpe Diem, to which I subscribe. Great blog. At AEI, Mark writes about economic and financial issues for America.com and the AEI Ideas blog. And he notably, and this is one thing I really love, he's notably revised and updated the 100 item list. So for every 100 girls, X number of boys. And it really is a great index for comparing the outcomes of boys and girls. So that's a really great project. And that project was started by Tom Mortensen, who's also here and is also on the board of advisors. He was on our panel earlier, also on the board of advisors for the Boys Initiative. So we're really excited for this talk. Welcome, Dr. Perry.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. I tested negative for COVID, but I do have kind of a cold and a cough, so I apologize if I have to take a break for any kind of coughing. And I should also make a minor correction that I'm now on emeritus status at both the American Enterprise Institute and the University of Michigan, so that I'm really concentrating now full-time efforts on my civil rights advocacy, helping boys and men from a legal standpoint. So I know I've followed the sessions earlier, and it was a lot of discussion about men and boys from sociological perspective and psychological perspective, and a lot of discussion on family and so on, and fatherhood. And so I'll shift a little bit now and talk about boys and men from a more of a legal standpoint, and talk about my efforts over the last 6 years to provide legal help for boys and men to thrive and advance in an educational environment that has become increasingly hostile in many ways to boys and men. And by the way, I'll try to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we can have 15 minutes, I think, for Q&A and discussion. But it was about 20 years ago that my friend and AEI colleague, Christina Summers, carefully documented the programs facing boys when she published her book, The War Against Boys, How Misguided Feminism is Harming Our Young Men. And I don't think we can say things have necessarily gotten better over the last 20 years. It might be the case that things have gotten worse, and I'll present some data later showing that. But I think we can all agree that boys have become the second sex in K through 12, which has led to troubles for men in higher education and in the labor market and in society overall, which Tom Mortensen has documented for decades, with higher rates of homelessness for men versus women, higher rates of alcohol, drug addiction and drug overdoses, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of being a victim of a serious violent crime, etc. So the war against boys and favoritism for girls really starts early in elementary school and continues through graduate school and the professional schools. So just one example, the Girls Who Code organization starts after school girl-only computer programs across the country for girls starting in grade 3, and those girl-only coding programs continue into high school and college. And now there's a Black Girls Code, Latina Girls Code, Native Girls Code, but nothing for boys. And if you look at their corporate sponsors of these programs, it's like a who's who of America's biggest virtue signaling woke corporations, including Apple, Microsoft, IBM, Delta, Lyft, Google, Macy's, Facebook, Nike, Verizon, Comcast, who are all falling all over themselves to throw money at sexist girl-only programs that illegally discriminate against boys, at least when the program is hosted by a public school, which is usually the case. So imagine trying to start a Boys Who Code organization and going to Apple or Microsoft or Google or Facebook and asking for the same generous donation they're giving to Girls Who Code. And I think we all kind of know what would happen in that case. So that explains my motivation over the last 6 years to pursue this one-man mission to expose and challenge the systemic and widespread sexism in America's education system that unfairly and illegally provides special preferences for girls and women while illegally excluding boys and men in violation of Title IX's clear prohibition of such sex discrimination. So let me just kind of explain how I got started and how I went from just professor of economics and finance and blogger into this new role as a kind of a civil rights activist. And it all started back in 2016 when I was teaching economics and finance at the University of Michigan in Flint, and about 50 miles away, I would occasionally hear that Michigan State in East Lansing, Michigan had a women's only lounge in their student union. And I went to visit that union and the women's only lounge. And I really couldn't believe that a university in 2016 was engaging in such illegal, well, let's call it gender apartheid, and had this prime real estate set aside only for women. So when you go into their student union building in the middle of campus, the entire wing of the first floor was set aside as a women's only lounge that had been there for 100 years. They had a plaque on the wall talking about the great history and how much the women on campus loved having this private space that excluded the male students from that lounge. And so I found it objectionable, and this is what got me started on this kind of new career path, is that I figured it had to be illegal. I figured it had to be a federal violation of Title IX, but at the time I didn't know the process. I didn't know how to file Title IX complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. But I also found it objectionable because I thought it was morally and ethically unacceptable for a public university accepting taxpayer funds to show such favoritism and allow preferences on the basis of sex. And then also it was in direct contradiction to what has become the holy trinity of today's higher education leftist wokeism of diversity, inclusion, and equity. I like that ordering better because then it's DIE. And so the women's only lounge was exactly the opposite. Instead of promoting gender diversity, it was promoting gender uniformity. It wasn't gender inclusive, it was gender exclusive, and it wasn't promoting gender equity, it was promoting gender inequity. And universities now invest heavily in their DIE efforts. I've documented that University of Michigan and Ohio State both have more than 150 full-time diversicrats who are full-time staff members with the words diversity, inclusion, or equity in their job titles, including dozens of Title IX officers and staff members. And the Title IX staff of the university is supposed to ensure that Title IX is being actively enforced, and the universities are legally required to regularly certify to the Department of Education as a condition of receiving federal funds that they are actively enforcing Title IX, and yet they're not, and so they're filing false certifications. So over the last 5 years, I've uncovered something like more than 2,000 Title IX and some Title VI violations at more than 600 colleges and universities, and also at many K through 12 schools, which demonstrates that most universities are not taking their Title IX obligations seriously, and that's part of the war on boys and men. And then I came to realize that the Michigan State's women-only lounge was a physically symbolic, visible representation of the widespread systemic sexism throughout all of higher education, but it's usually less visible, less obvious, and sometimes harder to detect than the segregated physical space on campus, or what I call gender apartheid. So you can give me 10 to 15 minutes on almost any college's website, and I can almost always uncover at least one program that violates Title IX, because there are almost always dozens of female-only scholarships and no scholarships exclusively for men. And that's what's motivated me, is to expose this systemic sexism and double standard in K through 12 and higher education for enforcing federal civil rights, enabled by an Office for Civil Rights that is frequently willing to allow universities to violate Title IX or support devious ways that allow schools to continue to discriminate against men. And then another reason that I found Michigan State's women-only lounge to be objectionable, along with the thousands of other Title IX violations that promote female favoritism is that I think that favoritism is totally unnecessary today in higher education. And now I'd like to share the screen here and show some slides. Let's see. Did that work?
Yep, they just
Mark
came
Zucker.
up. It's great. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So this shows the share of fall enrollment in degree granting post-secondary institutions. So community colleges, universities, and colleges in the United States. So we can see here when Title IX was passed in 1972, 57% of college students were male and 43% were female. Then Title IX was passed, and by 1979, just 7 years later, women started outnumbering men in terms of college enrollment. And then that gender imbalance favoring women grew and grew and grew until by around 2003, the trend had completely reversed. And now the gender imbalance was in favor of women, who had 57% of college enrollment compared to 57% male enrollment back in 1972.
Hello?
Then
Yeah, hi.
here's, let's see. Okay, here's the second slide is looking at the share of all college degrees,
What?
female versus male. And so this is associates, bachelor's, master's, and doctor's degrees. So again, when Title IX was passed in 72, 59% of college degrees were earned by men and only 41% by women. But by around 1982, women started out earning college degrees, or started earning more college degrees than men, and that gender imbalance continued to grow until by around 2007, the trend had completely reversed. The gender imbalance was now in favor of women, who were now getting 59% of college degrees versus 41% for men. And then here's just looking at the last college class of 2022, showing the gender imbalance at all levels of higher education, especially for associate's degrees and master's degrees, where women earn significantly greater percentage of the degrees than men. And so this is looking at females per 100 again. So for every 100 master's degrees earned by men, there's 154 women earning master's degrees. So huge gender imbalance. And then here's the cumulative college degree gap over the last 40 years. So starting in 82, when women started earning more degrees than men, women over that last 40-year period have earned 16 million more college degrees than men, including 7 million more bachelor's degrees. So again, this huge gender degree gap favoring women. Okay, so let me go back here. Okay, so so if the goal of Title IX was gender parity, as was originally, I think, presented, that was reached 40 years ago and is reversed so that men now have been an underrepresented minority in higher education for the last 40 years. But I don't think parity is enough for the misguided feminists, as Christina Summers called them. It's really now more about privilege, power, preferences, and payback than parity. And so the widespread systemic sexism reflected in thousands of ongoing Title IX violations is based on this outdated and false narrative that might describe the 1950s, but not today's reality. And the false narrative is that women are still somehow marginalized and victimized and oppressed, and they're facing challenges, obstacles, and discrimination in higher education that justifies favoritism, special preferences, and a hugely disproportionate share of campus resources that aren't available for men in the form of female-only scholarships, female-only fellowships, female-only awards for students, staff, faculty, and community members, female-only mentoring and tutoring programs, female-only engineering orientations, female-only industry meetings, girl-only summer STEM camps, girl-only coding programs like Girls Who Code, female leadership programs, female political training programs, female entrepreneurship programs, and even female-only recreation center hours, where they're all operating exclusively for women while illegally excluding and discriminating against boys and men. So that's kind of the background of my objection to Michigan State's gender apartheid. female favoritism and illegal discrimination that motivated my first, excuse me, civil rights complaint. Now, at the time, I didn't know how to file complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. So I filed a sex discrimination complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And then I leaked the story to some media contacts while the complaint was being evaluated. And then it kind of snowballed and got local and national coverage, including the Washington Post. And so due to that publicity and maybe the pending complaint, in the summer of 2016, Michigan State closed the women's lounge down for remodeling, as they said, and they reconfigured the space and reopened it in the fall, because if they had just taken the sign down off the wall and left the space the same, that really wouldn't have worked. So they had to go through this pretense of reconfiguring that space, and then it opened up in the fall. It was no longer a women's lounge, and then there was protests and sit-ins and demonstrations and petitions from the misguided feminists. And it kind of is an example of an insight from Thomas Sowell, who said that when people get used to preferential treatment, that then equal treatment to them seems like discrimination. So the women had gotten away with that for so long that then when it got taken away, they acted like they were the victims. But then having a major university correct a long-standing Title IX violation due to my efforts then kind of motivated me to continue challenging violations at other schools, and my Title IX antenna was up. I started looking for more violations, and that led to finding more than 2,000. And I really didn't have to wait too much long after that, because I got the annual email from my provost at the University of Michigan Flint that I had gotten every year for 20 years, but hadn't really paid attention. And there were 11 faculty awards that included cash. And of the 11 awards, I was only eligible for 6, because 3 were for female faculty only and 2 for minority faculty only. So I filed a civil rights complaint again with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And then shortly after that, the university agreed that those were illegal, and all 5 awards were then open to all faculty, regardless of sex or race. And it was another civil rights victory. Then shortly after that, I got a email that was sent to all faculty, staff, and students at University of Michigan Flint announcing the creation of this new GEMS program. And GEMS stands for Girls in Engineering, Math, and Science. And it was a summer camp for middle school girls only that was going to be introduced in the summer of 2017. And as soon as I got it, I again realized that that was completely illegal. I complained to the Title IX director in Ann Arbor, and the program was immediately changed to a co-educational program, but I'm sure would have continued as a girl-only program if I hadn't challenged it. And what really impressed me about that was that for a program like that to get to the point that it's being advertised and promoted with flyers and dates and everything and a schedule, it had to be approved by the faculty in the science departments. It had to be approved by the department chairs, and it would have gone to the dean, and then the dean and associate dean and assistant dean, and all the deans and deanlets would have had to approve the program. Then it would have gone to the provost and associate provost and assistant provost and assistant to the associate provost, and all the provosts would have had to sign off on it. So it would have been the case that dozens of administrators would have seen that program, and it's like not a single one of them ever thought to think, well, hey, maybe this program violates the federal the guaranteed federal civil rights of boys in the Flint community. And so it really then illustrated to me the unawareness of Title IX in higher education, or the unconcern about violating Title IX when the discrimination is against boys and men. So either college administrators are either unaware of federal civil rights laws, including Title IX, or they know they're violating Title IX, but they think they're somehow above the law. And I think it's a combination of unawareness and a lack of concern about violating Title IX with discrimination against males, especially because universities have violated Title IX with impunity for many decades because they've never been challenged before. I just filed a Title IX complaint versus Northwood University in Michigan for a women-only annual award program that has been around for more than 50 years. Started in 1970, even before Title IX, and I was the first one to ever challenge it. And the complaint is pending now with the Cleveland Office for Civil Rights. And even when they're exposed and successfully challenged, schools generally face fairly minimal consequences. There's usually no fines or penalties. There's no apologies, no admission of guilt. There's no payments to victims, et cetera. So I think there's a mentality in K through 12 and in higher education that we'll just violate the civil rights of boys and men for as long as we can, get away with it, to further our goals of misguided feminism and female favoritism, and then we'll make corrections if and when we get caught. So it's completely corrupt as well as illegal to think that there's, and unless you have good intentions, exception to Title IX when there's not, that sex-based discrimination is still unlawful, even if it advantages the right gender for the right reasons. So I next targeted the University of Ann Arbor, my employer at the time, really, where I found about 20 single-sex female-only programs and 30 female-only scholarships. And then I filed my first federal Title IX complaint with the Office for Civil Rights versus University of Michigan in June of 2018. It was evaluated and fairly quickly opened for an investigation because the complaint, I think the violations were so clear, but that's been almost 4 years now, and the investigation is still ongoing and still hasn't been resolved, I think because of the stubbornness of University of Michigan to make the corrections. And then since then, I've now filed a total of 660 federal civil rights complaints, which I think there was a Guinness Book of World Records designation for category for the most complaints ever filed by an individual. I think I could qualify. And that's for more than 2,000 violations, as I mentioned. So far, OCR has opened nearly 300 complaints for federal investigations. More than 200 investigations have been resolved, mostly in my favor. So I've been fairly successful so far defending the civil rights of boys and men and opening up to boys and men what were previously female-only academic programs, scholarships, fellowships, awards, and STEM camps, and even some girls who code programs. And so here's what I've learned over the last 4 years about the Office for Civil Rights and Title IX complaints. First, it's a federal agency, it's a bureaucracy. They generally operate with what I'd call snail-like inefficiency, both in terms of evaluating complaints, which can sometimes take a year or more, and then in terms of investigations, which can go on for several years or more, like in the case of the University of Michigan. But it's kind of troubling because Title IX is a very clear law. It's only 37 words. And the violations that I report are very clear violations. I want to make sure I have overwhelming evidence of sex discrimination before I waste my time and their time. So it really doesn't seem like it should take that long. But Title IX says no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination. And my goal is to make sure that's interpreted as no boy, no man, no girl, and no woman in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be discriminated against, because the way it's generally been interpreted and applied is that no woman shall face discrimination, but then they sometimes forget that it equally applies to boys and men are equally protected under Title IX. So I think the speed of resolving a complaint and investigation has something to do with the willingness or stubbornness of the universities to correct their violations. And many, if they're honest and ethical and they get caught, they just want to resolve it and end a federal civil rights investigation as soon as possible. And they often could move very quickly to correct the violations. And if the university makes the corrections at the beginning of an investigation, then they can usually get the case resolved by having it technically dismissed, even though it's really been dissolved, in my favor. And the OCR says they'll dismiss a complaint if it obtains credible information during an investigation indicating that the complaint is currently resolved. So the universities do have some incentive to try to resolve the violation during the course of the investigation. If the complaint is not resolved with kind of those quick voluntary corrections, then OCR will end its investigation and they'll issue a voluntary resolution agreement, a document, which I think is what universities are usually trying to avoid, because then the OCR will dictate to the university how the violation will be resolved. And then there's often reporting requirements for a number of years, and then sometimes some required remedial Title IX training for staff. But I've had more than a dozen voluntary resolution agreements, which are the strongest type of resolution and the most desirable for me. They're generally signed by the president or chancellor of the university, indicating, the seriousness of a university violating federal civil rights law, that the president has to sign off on it at the end of a voluntary resolution agreement. But most resolutions have been in the form of what the OCR would call a dismissal, when a university would either terminate its discriminatory program or convert a female-only program to a coeducational program open to all genders, although sometimes they do it somewhat deceptively. So for example, Harvard has a $13,000 one-week women's leadership initiative program, and I challenged it, and they made the following change to their eligibility criteria as a way to correct their violation. And it says, while the program is focused on women and those who identify as women executives, the program is open to all executives who meet the admissions criteria. So if a man wants to pay $13,000 for a one-week program to study women's leadership, he could do that, but of course that's not going to happen. Stanford's executive program has a women's leadership executive program for women's leadership. It's for women 8 to 12 years into their careers. And then in small print buried at the bottom, they added a statement, which we call a legal fig leaf, I guess. Consistent with its non-discrimination policy, Stanford's programs are open to participants regardless of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and so on. So there's also been in recent years a new kind of coordinated effort at OCR to request a complainant to provide names of actual male victims of sex discrimination, even though what's called legal standing is not required for an OCR complaint. They'll send a letter to me and say, do you have any evidence of a male individual who, because of his sex, has been excluded from this female-only program? If so, identify that person by name and the date of said exclusion and provide their contact information. Okay, so I've tried to use the kind of reasonable person standard, suggesting that reasonable males are not going to waste their time in an exercise in futility applying for a program for which they are clearly not eligible. For example, there's a girl-only STEM program at Keene State College in New Hampshire. I just filed a complaint against it. And they asked me for names of actual victims, but the program is called Go STEM Camp, the Go STEM Camp, where the college clearly states on the program website that the GO in Go STEM stands for girls only. So that would be kind of like, what boy is going to waste his time applying for a program where it's clearly for girls only, and that's actually in the name of the program. And then many times for female-only programs like faculty fellowships, there could be time-consuming application materials required, statements of interest, letters of recommendation, references, budgets. And so it would just be also a huge burden for a male professor to apply for a female-only fellowship when he knows that he's not going to get that. And the failure to identify any actual male victims of sex discrimination doesn't do anything to prove that the school's female-only programs are lawful. It actually helps conclusively prove that the illegal discrimination against males has been so effective and successful that there's been no males who have applied, which is the intent of the program. But OCR attorneys now cite in their dismissal letters, even when the university does make corrections, that the complainant was unable to provide any names of actual victims. So, the OCR has always had its thumbs on the scale in favor of enabling universities to violate Title IX and discriminate against boys and men, as evidenced by the many illegal female-only programs that have existed for 20, 30, 40 years without any corrections, but I think their thumbs have gotten a little bit bigger in the last couple of years under the new administration, despite very strong statements last year from both Education Secretary Cardona and President Biden, that's where they said Title IX protects the civil rights of all students, and all students will be guaranteed an educational environment free from discrimination on the basis of sex, unless I guess you're a boy or a man, because those statements seem to be somewhat contradicted by some of the recent actions of OCR over the last year. So I'll start concluding here and just say that, we really need to be vigilant and aware of sex discrimination in K through 12, community colleges, universities, and our local communities, because the message clearly hasn't gotten through to public schools and colleges that it's illegal to offer female-only programs that exclude boys and men. For example, in the suburb of Minneapolis last July, there was a news report about 2 female Eden Prairie High School students for sharing their passion for STEM by hosting a free 4-day summer camp for girls from August 1st to 4th. Girls in grades 1 to 4. So I guess here the discrimination is actually starting in the first grade. Girls in grades 1 to 4 are invited to register for Girl Boss, Girls in STEM Summer Camp through Eden Prairie Community Education. I filed a complaint against that program, and it's still being evaluated. Then earlier this year, New York Law School announced that Judge Judy Scheinland makes a legacy gift to New York Law School to support women in the law. That's the television icon, Judge Judy, who graduated from that law school. The report said on the university website or the law school website, when fully implemented, New York Law School will host 10 women annually who will receive full tuition scholarship, a book stipend, and a summer employment fellowship after their first year of law school. Very generous benefit. What's also interesting is the article said, women now make up over 62% of the overall New York Law School student body. The scholarship will provide girls and women an opportunity to learn about law as a career pathway. So despite the fact that such sex discrimination is illegal and unethical, it's also the case it's totally unnecessary to provide girls and women an opportunity to learn about the law when there's 162 female law students at New York Law School for every 100 men. So usually schools try to help the underrepresented minorities, that would be men in this case, and not the overrepresented majority, women in this case, by far. So again, to conclude here, I think I've gone about 30 minutes. So if or when you become aware of a girl-only K through 12 program that exclude boys, we should challenge those programs either internally with the school or school district, and especially if it's a public school. And if that doesn't work, we can file federal civil rights complaints with the Office for Civil Rights, if it's especially if at the K through 12 level, if it's a public school, because they all accept federal financial assistance through the Department of Education. So they're required to enforce Title IX. I'm very familiar now with the complaint process at OCR after filing 650 complaints or more. And I'm happy to work with anybody to either file a Title IX complaint for discrimination against boys and men under my name only, or I can work with you to file a complaint under your name. So let's work together to help boys and men thrive and prosper and help them reach their potential. Totally committed to help protect the legally guaranteed civil rights of boys and men and combat the widespread and systemic sexism that has illegally excluded them from thousands of educational and financial aid opportunities that have been exclusively and illegally available for only girls and women. So that concludes my prepared remarks. Be happy to take any questions or have some discussion.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Perry. Great information. That is a lot of complaints. It would be fun if you do get into the Guinness Book of Records for that. So I'll look forward.
Okay.
We do have some questions and comments in the chat. So I'm going to go first to Representative Dye. She asked, and if you'd like to follow up, you can chime in a second. But if there are similar award opportunities for men, like diverse offerings for various groups, then has the university system met the Title IX obligation, or does the non-discrimination require no distinct awards for gender and race at all? So did your lawsuits change the way they apply Title IX? That's the second part.
Well, first of all, they're not lawsuits, and there's no plaintiff, and there's nobody with legal standing. It's really an administrative complaint to OCR objecting to the fact that universities accept federal financial assistance with a legal obligation to enforce Title IX when they're really not enforcing it. So what's been happening is that this could be for a summer STEM program or for a faculty award. You could have a female faculty of the year award and a male faculty of the year award, or a female student of the year and a male student of the year. Or you could have a summer STEM camp for boys and a summer STEM camp for girls. So in some cases, universities will correct a Title IX violation, or they'll know in advance they're going to provide some certain educational opportunities for girls or women. They have to provide those same educational opportunities for men. And for awards, what's happened is I've challenged a number of awards programs at universities. They will often convert those, instead of women of the year, it'll just be people of the year or something, where they will convert it from a female only award program to a award program for anybody. Now, what's happened, of course, recently, because I have filed a lot of Title IX complaints, there's a lot of now women of color, men of color. So a lot of times they'll try to have men of color programs or men of color scholarships, or women of color programs or women of color scholarships. And I've also filed complaints against those, because according to federal civil rights law, your race or sex is not supposed to help you and it's not supposed to harm you. And a university is not allowed to treat individuals differently on the basis of their sex or race when determining whether or not they're eligible for a program or a scholarship or a fellowship or an award. So you could have a male only program. Well, here's one example. Eastern Michigan near Ann Arbor, near Detroit. Eastern Michigan had a program, and it was let's see, what was it called? It was some program for girls, Digital Divas. And it was a summer program for girls. And I complained, and then they said, okay, well, we've got the Digital Divas program, we're going to start the Digital Dudes program. So then they had a Digital Dudes program for boys and one for girls, but you're not really allowed to accommodate one sex or gender without providing equal accommodations to the other. So really, you have to accommodate everybody in one program, a coeducational program, or you can have separate but equal types of programs. And I think then you could comply with Title IX or Title VI that way, by having comparable programs for males and females.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. And of course, you brought up the camps. And of course, as a parent, having camp opportunities that are for girls only and for boys only serves different needs, right? And so I don't see that as violation if there's opportunities for both. And then the question about having girls only and boys only schools, I know that my girls were in a school that was both genders, but there was a lot of sideboards around the relationships. They were kept genteel and there were a lot of boundaries. And the girls stated that it removed the drama from the classroom, that one girl thought that a boy liked her better than another, and there was all of that. So you have those maturational pieces that play in, and I didn't know how you felt about the idea of building that into recognition of gender differences.
I think there's an exception to Title IX that you can, like at the K through 12 level, you are allowed, like for a charter school, for example, you could have a boy only charter school or a girl only charter school, and that's compliant with Title IX, or it doesn't violate Title IX. So that is an exception, I guess, to accommodate the fact that maybe there is a need for some parents to want their child to either go to an all boy or an all girl school. And so that's a way that they can still do that and not run afoul of Title IX.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Appreciate the question and the comments. All right, a couple of comments and then one person. Mark, you have your hand raised. I'll get to you in just a second. I've got a couple from the chat I just want to read through. First of all, we have, thank you for your use of data. Just like, oftentimes people use stories, but they appreciate your use of data. Mark's work in efforts to enforce Title IX for men and boys has been awesome and continues to get great results. Thank you. So you've got fans out there. Comment from Lynn Halligan. When awards are given at graduations, going back as far as elementary schools, whether it's in the form of Athlete of the Year or academic awards, in my experience, girls get the lion's share way more of the time than boys, and boys feel excluded. Not asking for gratuitous awards for boys, but one more example of the system having some issues. So that's an interesting point to notice. And I guess it depends. Are those awards, for instance, academic awards that are given out with the person with the highest grades? And we've seen there's discrimination against boys, their grading in school. So if you're giving an award for grades and you've discriminated against boys for 13 years and how you grade them, there's going to be fewer of them getting the awards, right? So that's another issue to deal with. I think good. So Mark Sherman, if you could unmute and ask your question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Mark, for all the work you've done. I think I sent something in on that. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, a major problem for me is the fact, I've been involved in this issue for 30 years, and I'm a liberal Democrat. And my people, quote, don't care about any of this. I mean, they do not care at all. I saw you on television and you were with, what's his name, the guy on Fox News, who everybody who's a liberal hates, Tucker Carlson. And I thought, this is great. This is fantastic. There's data. It's wonderful. Have you been on CNN? Have you been on MSNBC? If you have, let me know. That to me, until that changes, and I know that Representative Dye is in Washington. I think she's a Republican. I lobby people from all the way over in Mid-Hudson Valley of New York State, because of the efforts of Blair Daley, to try to get the state of Washington to start a commission for boys and men. It went nowhere. This is standard. And it went nowhere because Democrats absolutely don't care about it. Until that changes, we are screwed, if you pardon the expression, okay? And I'll say one other thing. I applaud what you're doing, but there's another approach. And believe me, I'm so angry about this. Suing, it makes sense. I think, boy, I have 3 sons, I have 5 grandsons. And believe me, when you have all males in your family, and the grandsons go from 5 to 17, and they're already seeing what's going on, they know what's happening. They know how this country looks at them. That's very frustrating. I'll say one other thing. There was a program on writing in a campus that I was associated with, State University of New York in New Paltz. There was stuff for boys and girls, and there was special programs for girls. I was furious. My temptation was to say, I'm going to talk to Title IX. I did something different. I spoke to the people involved, and I said, if I can get some money for something for boys, will you do it? And I was able to get some money together, and they ran a program for boys. I mean, in other words, that's another approach. Believe me, I'm angry enough to want to sue everybody, but there's another approach is to talk to people, which not when I'm feeling this way, because I'm furious for various reasons, but to talk to people quietly and say, have you ever realized that maybe boys are not doing so great? And half the time they'll say, we didn't know that. That data you showed about college enrollments, I've known about that for 30 years.
Hey there.
I'll shut up.
That's great. Great comment. And there are a lot of good points in there. I want to first mention that Representative Dye mentioned, I'm running the bill again with lots more support thanks to Blair Daley. So I would suggest to you, if there's any way any of us can support you on that. I know a lot of us are in touch with Blair, so that would be great. And then also she writes, it's a better bill because I've engaged with Democrats like you, Mark Sherman. So thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
That's great. And quickly, Mark, the more either centrist or maybe more liberal news outlets, you mentioned you've been on Fox, which is more conservative. Do any of these, we've got, and by the way, we're at 3 minutes, so we're almost done, but do any of these more moderate or left-wing outlets ever have you on?
No.
Short answer, no.
Of course not.
Okay.
Well, I've always, kind of braced myself for like blowback, that I'm going to get all sorts, I'm going to be viciously attacked on Twitter or Facebook or by email, but I almost get no reaction, which I think is either because there's no really logical counter argument to say that, yeah, we think it's okay that Title IX is applied, with a double standard. That's not a legitimate position. Or maybe they just think, yeah, this guy is stirring up trouble. We don't want to give him any oxygen. We don't want to give him any attention. So I always think I'm going to get blasted, but it hasn't happened. But usually, of course, where I get the most media coverage is in like the College Fix, which covers these kinds of issues. And campus reform and minding the campus is where I've gotten most of the, kind of media attention. But when I file complaints against programs, I'll often like send copies of my complaint to the student newspaper, hoping to get them kind of charged up about the fact that their university might be under federal investigation. And I can't ever seem to get them interested in reporting how it seems kind of like an important story, or at least controversial story. So yeah, so it's been a little bit of a issue trying to get more media attention, but I think, ideally for me, I can just file one complaint at a time, but if there was ever congressional hearings, for example, to bring universities in to explain why they're not enforcing federal civil rights laws, even though they have to, that would be one example. Or if we had a change in administration and there was a more friendly Office for Civil Rights, if they would ever send out some kind of guidance letter and say, hey, universities, there's thousands of these violations. You have to start doing a better job doing audits on your own campus to enforce federal civil rights laws. But yeah, not a lot of media attention from CNN or CNN or MSNBC.
Right, we're almost done. We have about a minute. We have one more comment from Representative Dye. So if you could make one more quick comment, and then we'll let everyone back to the main room.
Very quickly, I sit on the Women's Commission. I mentioned to one of the colleagues on the Women's Commission that I was running a men's commission bill, and she said, why would you do that? They have privilege. Any comments?
I would say if you had the privilege hierarchy in higher education, men would be at the very bottom of that privilege hierarchy. Women would be at the top. And if you're a white man, you'd be at the very bottom. You would actually have, I think they have, it's like almost a conspiracy. They don't want white men to get any kind of special privileges or attention or just even financial aid. Everything is geared towards women or BIPOCs or people of color. So as for men are at the bottom of the privilege hierarchy, not at the top.
Okay, and with that, thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone who came and joined the session. Thank you for your great comments. There's a few more comments in the chat. I don't think we're gonna have time, but I'm seeing people need, I like this from Lynn Halligan, another comment from her. People need to see if it affects all of us if one sex is not doing well. The competition between the sexes needs to be removed. That's a great sentiment, and I think we will close with that. So I want to thank Dr. Mark Perry for your time today and your expertise. I'd like to, again, thank all of you for attending, and this breakout room will be self-destructing in a few seconds, so it'll just close, or you can just click on the Leave breakout room. And we'll see you back in the main session. Once again, thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.